¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo les va? Esto es Malvinas Historia de Héroes y Traidores, programa número 285 de la 10ª temporada. Hoy vamos a ver la segunda parte de un video británico. Se van a encontrar con que el primer minuto es una repetición de lo que dejamos la semana pasada, pero que es para que ustedes puedan seguir el relato. Lo interesante de esta parte es que cuentan por qué hundieron al general Belgrano. Y lo que yo les venía contando desde hace 41 años atrás, ellos estaban creídos que arriba del general Belgrano tenían el Exocet. Por eso lo hundieron, porque para ellos era el único barco que les podía traer problemas. Así que vamos al video y préstenle atención, porque ellos cuentan que no la sacaron de arriba, que les fue muy difícil. Y es la versión británica. Adelante, cuando quiera.
On the 1st of May, Woodward's main task force was 100 miles northeast of the Falklands. The British government had declared a 200-mile exclusion zone around the islands and said it would attack anyone entering it. Up here to the northwest, a cluster of Argentinian warships was approaching. Among them, the Argentinian flagship, the aircraft carrier the 25 de Mayo. She carried aircraft that would soon be within close range of the British fleet. But even more menacing, the British reckoned, was another group of ships to the south of the Falklands. A cruiser, the General Belgrano, and two destroyers, which the British believed were armed with lethal Exocet missiles. These missiles could sink the British aircraft carriers if they got within range. The Royal Navy could not afford to risk an Exocet attack on its vital carriers. The loss of even one carrier and her combat aircraft could mean defeat. Without both, the British task force would have to withdraw from the fight completely. The Argentinians appeared to be threatening a pincer movement against the British fleet. The carrier, the 25 de Mayo, from the north, and the Belgrano group from the south. The Belgrano group was being tracked by a submerged British submarine, the Conqueror. Conqueror's captain feared that if the Belgrano turned north, it would move into these shallow waters. The Conqueror would struggle to track the ship in the shallow water and risk losing sight of it. The Belgrano might then head for the British fleet and put the task force in grave danger. Beneath the waves, Conqueror's commanding officer saw that the Belgrano was steering an erratic course just outside the exclusion zone. The situation was so critical that the Prime Minister herself was consulted. She gave the order to attack. The Conqueror launched its torpedoes.
There were masses of injured men. Most of them had been burnt, and there were men covered in oil. When I got to my life raft, I asked a sailor to come with me again and look for the people that were missing, including the commander.
Within 45 minutes, the Belgrano had sunk. Immediately, the entire Argentinian navy, fearful of further submarine attacks, turned round and headed home. The British had scored a huge military success, and Galtieri's plan seemed to be faltering. But he was still able to unleash the weapon the British feared most. The Argentinians had recently bought 5 air-launched Exocets. These half-ton missiles could seek out and destroy a ship from over 30 miles away. On the morning of the 4th of May, 2 Argentinian strike aircraft, each armed with an Exocet, took off from the mainland. On that particular day in 1982, Woodward posted 3 ships like this as his front line of defence. They were destroyers: HMS Coventry, HMS Glasgow and HMS Sheffield. They were armed with anti-aircraft missiles. These ships could shoot down aircraft, but they were unreliable against low-altitude targets like Exocets. That morning, things had been relatively quiet for the British task force.
This is Alpha Whiskey, weapons free, Baker 5017, a strength 2.
Then, just before 2 o'clock, the Argentinian aircraft were picked up by the radar room on board HMS Glasgow. Glasgow immediately sent an urgent warning to all the other ships and went to full action stations herself.
Break! 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 We're going atop the ship. Reminded the command area remains to
But 20 miles away, on board HMS Sheffield, the scene couldn't have been more different.
Here, the ops room wasn't fully manned, and only part of the message from the Glasgow was picked up. But it was worse than that. At that exact moment, HMS Sheffield was using its satellite equipment to send a message back to Britain, and that blocked its radar. The Sheffield couldn't see the Argentinian aircraft approaching.
Aircraft now returning inbound at red 100.
Back on the Glasgow, 2 fast-moving dots, possible Exocet missiles, suddenly appeared on the radar screen and were closing in at 700 miles an hour. With a mixture of relief and horror, the captain of the Glasgow realized that the missiles were headed not for them, but straight for the Sheffield. HMS Sheffield was the first British ship to be destroyed by enemy action since the Second World War. Of the 281 men aboard, 20 were killed and 26 were wounded. Blood had now been shed on both sides of the conflict. By mid-May, the South Atlantic winter was closing in. Some Harriers had been lost in combat, and now the bad weather was beginning to hinder the pilots. The success of the British plan relied on having complete control of the air to provide cover for landing the ground troops. But the British didn't have that cover, and now time was running out. It was politically unthinkable to abandon the operation now. They would have to take the huge risk of putting in the ground troops without total air cover. On the 18th of May, the second wave of ships, including ferries and the cruise liner the Canberra, arrived just off the Falklands. On board was the amphibious landing force. The 3,000 men were a mixture of Royal Marine Commandos and Army paratroopers. And they were led by Brigadier Julian Thompson. Thompson was an experienced commander. He knew that his troops were vulnerable without air superiority. But the pressure of time meant the landings had to go ahead. The British had looked at all the landing site options on both West and East Falkland. Since Stanley over here was their ultimate target, it made sense to land here on East Falkland. They plumped for this natural harbour here at San Carlos Bay. It would be out of range of enemy artillery and was only very lightly defended. A great advantage for any amphibious landing. And here I am with San Carlos Bay behind me. And that's where the British landing force came in. These hills also offered Thompson's men and ships some protection against low-level air attack. But there was one problem with this landing site. It was a long way from San Carlos here, across to the spot where Thompson knew the decisive battle would be fought, here in the strongly defended mountains just west of Stanley. Between the two, was 50 miles of difficult country. Thompson planned to move his landing force right across the island with a shipment of helicopters that were due to arrive any day. But now, the priority was to get his men on dry land as soon as possible.
In the early hours of the 21st of May, 3,000 British troops headed for the landing beaches. Each man carried his rifle, ammunition, and enough rations for 2 days. This was the moment they'd been waiting for weeks. Once ashore, the British troops made their way up into the hills and dug themselves into strong positions. One unit, the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, known as 2 Para, were based up here on the Sussex Mountains overlooking the bay. It was just a question of time before the Argentinians arrived. The men braced themselves for an air attack. Then, at 10:30, all hell broke loose.
The Argentinian High Command sent in wave after wave of their fighter bombers from the mainland. For 5 hours, these aircraft bombed and strafed the fleet sitting in the bay. The surrounding hills made it almost impossible for the ship's radars to detect the enemy aircraft. So the British were unable to get a fix on the attacking planes until it was too late.
From these positions up here, the Paras had a grandstand view of the action in the bay. All their supplies for the land campaign were still being unloaded from those ships coming under attack. The Paras had to watch helplessly as their lifeline was under fire.
By the end of the day, 5 British warships were hit, and one ship, HMS Ardent, was sinking.
And the attacks continued on the next day. The British had positioned anti-aircraft missiles around the bay, but it would be days before these delicate units were operational. On the water, the men had resorted to strapping machine guns onto the ship's rails in a desperate attempt to hit the low-flying Argentinian jets. More conventional anti-aircraft guns, some operated by sailors as young as 17, did score a few successes. But all these efforts did little to blunt the relentless onslaught of the Argentinian Air Force.
The British ships unloading vital supplies for the land campaign made easy targets. On May the 23rd, HMS Antelope, just out there, was the next vessel to take a fatal hit.
We watched with lumps in our throats as Antelope raged with fire and finally sank. She was our escort and everybody felt a great loss. She was more than just a ship to us.
In 4 days, 8 British ships were damaged and 2 sunk. During these attacks, 25 men died and many more were injured. While the British were reeling from the attacks in San Carlos water, the Argentinians were celebrating their triumphs. On the 25th of May, it was Argentina's National Day, a day of patriotic ceremony. And after the successes of their air campaign, Menendez and his troops in the Falklands had even more reason to celebrate.
Subordinación y valor.
But it wasn't over yet. The Argentinian Air Force was preparing another raid that would hit the British land campaign where it really hurt. A massive container ship, the Atlantic Conveyor, had just arrived from Britain. She was loaded with thousands of tons of supplies, but more importantly, the helicopters needed by the British forces to get them to Stanley. She was preparing to go into San Carlos that night.
At 3:36 p.m. on the 25th of May, two Argentinian aircraft flying from the mainland picked up the British carrier group just off East Falkland.
Once in range, they released their Exocets. The missiles locked on to two frigates. The ships fired up metal foil to confuse the missiles' radar, and the Exocets veered away. But then they found another target, the defenseless Atlantic Conveyor. Fire ripped through the ship, and all 9 helicopters still on board were destroyed.
Thompson was relying on them to carry his men across East Falkland to Stanley. At one stroke, most of his transport had now disappeared.
Margaret Thatcher wanted Stanley back in British hands quickly, but the main British force was still 50 miles away.
And with no helicopters, the only way for the troops to get there was to walk. The Marines called it yomping, and this was to be one of the classic yomps of all time. Men carried up to 120 pounds of kit on their backs through very uneven ground and with the rain lashing down. The men had 4 days of hard marching ahead of them. And at the end of this slog, they would have to fight a battle. The British main force of 2,000 men were on the move to Stanley. But one unit of around 500 men was going in a completely different direction. The men of Para weren't heading east towards Stanley, they were heading south towards a settlement that was heavily garrisoned by Argentinian troops. They had been ordered to win a quick and morale-boosting victory, but the battle that lay ahead of them wouldn't go as planned. The name of the settlement was Goose Green.
The Argentinians had a base at Goose Green because of its strategic importance. It's on a narrow strip of land just 5 miles long by a mile wide. So the Argentinians had stationed an infantry regiment here, centered around a small grassy airstrip.
This is Goose Green settlement, and San Carlos is beyond those mountains way over the distance there. Here's Goose Green on the map case. Aware of the British landing at San Carlos, the Argentinians reinforced their garrison here at Goose Green, fearing an attack from the north. Ready for a British assault, all they could do now was wait.
The man in command of Para was Colonel H. Jones. Known as H to his men, he was brave but impulsive, and he believed in leading from the front. Jones knew Goose Green would be a formidable target, and he drew up a detailed battle plan. The ground at Goose Green was wide open and featureless, offering little protection. Jones's objectives were the airstrip and the settlement of Goose Green held by the Argentinians. Para was split into several companies. They would fight their way south in the dark and then close in on the airfield. Then they would take the settlement in daylight. But the Argentinians held a strong position on the high ground of Darwin Hill. They were protected by minefields in front and supporting artillery back behind the airfield.
10:30 that night, the British began the attack. One company, about 100 men, moved rapidly up here on the left, clearing out any enemy positions that they came across.
Dos reflexiones sobre lo que vimos. La primera es para comentarles que ellos creían que el Exocet solamente estaba, como había dicho, en el General Belgrano. Argentina había comprado 20 misiles Exocet que eran mar-mar. Como Francia era parte de la OTAN, le hizo un embargo a la Argentina y solo les entregó 5 y no les entregó los planos para poderlos disparar. O sea que todo eso fue hecho por la ingeniería de la gente de la Marina. Lo que ellos no esperaban era que la gente de la Marina pudiera adaptar un Exocet a un avión. Tampoco lo esperaba la firma aeroespacial, que fue la que construyó los Exocet. Cada Exocet salía 5 millones de dólares, pero un día, un barco que salía 25 millones de dólares. Acá la información sobre el ataque al Atlantic Conveyor está un poco tomada de los pelos, porque en realidad era un objetivo. Se sabía que arriba de ese portacontenedores ellos llevaban agua potable, pastillas para hacer que el agua sea potable del agua que sacaban de la tierra, comida, ropa seca, municiones y los famosos helicópteros. Pero bueno, la versión es británica, así que ellos pueden contarlo como a ellos les parezca. Pero a ustedes les aclara todo el panorama que durante años venimos pregonando los que hacemos Malvinas. No fue una simple batalla, fue una guerra, como lo dijeron ellos. Y otra de las cosas que se muestran en el video es que, como lo dice el conductor, a mediados de mayo se puso el agua muy inestable y los barcos no podían estar, había neblina, no se podía salir. Bueno, en ese mes de mayo, entre mayo y junio, era que Argentina había decidido recuperar las islas para que los barcos no pudieran llegar. Pero los acontecimientos de fines de marzo del 82 hicieron que se adelantara la recuperación de las islas y que todo lo que se había planificado se fuera por la borda. Este video es muy esclarecedor porque nos está contando el otro lado de la guerra. Ustedes el lado argentino ya lo conocen, hemos pasado las imágenes miles de veces, pero esta versión británica es muy esclarecedora. Así que la semana que viene vemos el final de este video y espero que les haya gustado. Nos vemos la semana que viene y nos despedimos como lo hacemos todas las semanas. Dios y patria o muerte.
Medalla en el pecho, clavada en el corazón, y una visión de Dios, de celeste y blanco, navegando entre los mares. En las noches ves fantasmas que muerden el pabellón. En las aguas bajo el frío